The story begins with a stretch of land that most people ignored. It wasn't the kind of land you'd see advertised with billboards or the type a realtor would gush about with flowery descriptions. No, this land was tucked away behind old roads and wooded paths, a piece of property that had been in my family for generations. My grandfather had worked the soil until his last days, and when the world around him modernized, he held on to that property like it was part of his soul. Eventually, it came into my possession, not by desire, but by inheritance. I wasn't the type to farm. I wasn't the type to build. But I valued legacy, and my grandfather's land was more than soil and trees. It was his blood, sweat, and tears. I had no plans for it, but I had no intentions of selling either. That alone would later trigger a chain of events I could never have imagined. The property itself stretched wide. Acres of untouched earth. A small dam built decades ago to collect rainwater and rolling hills that could have been transformed into suburban developments if greed ever took hold. My family had always used the dam responsibly, ensuring that downstream communities received fair water flow while our property retained enough for irrigation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it mattered. But to people outside my family, that land was more than legacy. It was profit, and profit, when mixed with the machinery of homeowners associations, becomes a weapon. The trouble started when the county rezoned parcels of land nearby. What was once rural became suburban. Developers swooped in like vultures, buying every square inch they could get their hands on. Within months, a large housing project was proposed, 35 homes, marketed as a private, gated community. On glossy brochures, it looked perfect. Winding cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, smiling families, and the tagline, "Luxury Living with HOA Security." The HOA didn't exist yet, but the developers made sure to outline it in their pitch. They promised regulation, uniformity, and that every homeowner would be protected under a community-first association. What they didn't advertise was the problem with the land boundaries. You see, developers tend to rush. They measure plots not with respect, but with ambition. And when ambition meets carelessness, mistakes are made. The kind of mistakes that end up costing people everything. At first, I didn't notice anything. Construction began at the far edge of their property, well away from mine. The sound of bulldozers echoed in the distance, but I ignored it. I thought nothing of it. After all, it wasn't my concern. But as the weeks passed, I noticed something odd. The workers didn't stop at the boundary. They crossed over, at first just a few feet, then more. Slowly but surely, the construction crept into my family's land. I checked the county records. My deed was clear. The boundary lines were sharp and undisputable. Yet, when I spoke to the site manager, he waved me off. "We're following the plans," he said. "If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA once it's established." That was the first time I heard the term used against me, as if an HOA that didn't even exist yet somehow had authority over land that was rightfully mine. Weeks turned into months. By the time I returned to check again, I couldn't believe what I saw. Not one, not two, but several half-finished homes were being built squarely on my property. Driveways poured into my soil, foundations dug into my earth, walls rising against the skyline where once only trees had stood. My land was being stolen in broad daylight. I tried to stop it. I filed complaints with the county. I brought my deed, maps, and records. But bureaucracy moves slower than bulldozers, and by the time officials agreed to look into it, the houses were nearly complete. Then came the letters. Not from the county, but from the brand new Homeowners Association itself. They accused me of trespassing on my own land. The audacity was staggering. They claimed my dam, my water reservoir, was part of their community property, They demanded access, and worse, they fined me for violating HOA bylaws that didn't even apply to me. It was absurd. Illegal. But the homeowners didn't care. They'd bought houses, they'd signed paperwork, and they believed the HOA when it told them they owned the land. 35 families, all thinking they were the rightful residents of homes that sat on property stolen from me. For weeks, I battled them in paperwork, appeals, and court filings. But developers had deep pockets, and HOAs had lawyers on retainer. Meanwhile, I was just one man with inherited land and a dam nobody thought much about. That dam, however, was the key. It was the one thing my grandfather had built with foresight, and it was the one piece of leverage nobody seemed to realize I had. The homes, as pristine as they looked, were built recklessly. Foundations too shallow, drainage systems poorly designed, and reliance on my dam's water flow to keep their artificial lakes and decorative ponds filled. They needed me, though they didn't know it yet. They thought they had won. They thought I was powerless. But they were wrong. The letters became more aggressive. Threats piled up. One notice even claimed they would sue me for obstructing community resources. That's when I decided I wouldn't play their game anymore. My grandfather had taught me patience, but he had also taught me justice. And sometimes justice requires more than words. The dam had always been under my control. A simple mechanism, old but reliable, kept the water contained. But like all dams, it could be opened. It could be unleashed. And when you unleash water, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't check property lines. It simply flows where gravity takes it. I didn't decide immediately. For days, I walked the perimeter of the land, watching those houses rise, watching families move in, watching them laugh, grill on their patios, and decorate their new homes, completely unaware they were living on stolen soil. The injustice burned hotter each time I saw it. Then came the final straw. A certified letter from the HOA arrived, stating they had officially annexed my land into their jurisdiction. According to them, my property was now under HOA regulation, and the dam was to be handed over immediately for community management. They even had the gall to say my continued ownership was disruptive to neighborhood harmony. That was it. I stood before the dam that evening, staring at the heavy gate that held back millions of gallons of collected rainwater. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that land is only as strong as the will of the one who defends it. For months, I had fought with papers and phone calls. None of it mattered. But here, right now, I had the power to make them listen. My hands gripped the wheel of the gate. With one turn, everything would change. And as the metal groaned, and the first surge of water rushed forward, I knew the battle had only just begun. The moment the dam's gate creaked open, the quiet of my land was shattered. The first gush of water surged forward, foaming and roaring as it tumbled over the rocks below. It wasn't a violent flood at first. It was a steady, determined release. Like the kind of anger that doesn't scream but instead smolders and spreads. The reservoir, built up over seasons of rain, finally had an outlet, and gravity did the rest. The stream cut through the earth, flowing faster and wider with every passing second. Downhill, the water had only one destination: the newly built subdivision. Those pristine streets, those neatly manicured lawns, and those hollow houses with paper-thin foundations had no defenses. They had been designed for appearances, not for survival. At first, the water pooled harmlessly in ditches and storm drains. But the infrastructure couldn't keep up. The development had been built with speed, not foresight, and the drains quickly clogged with debris. From there, the water spread outward, snaking into yards and driveways, seeping into basements that hadn't even settled into the ground yet. It wasn't an explosive destruction. It was worse. It was slow, creeping, and unstoppable. Like watching dominoes fall in silence. Homeowners, many still unpacking their boxes, soon discovered their dream houses were not as solid as the glossy brochures promised. Carpet soaked. Electrical systems sparked. Newly laid sod turned into swamp. Within hours, panic set in. But while they scrambled, I stood from a distance, high on my land, watching it unfold. This wasn't vengeance for the sake of cruelty. This was balance being restored. For months they had mocked my claims, dismissed my deeds, and tried to erase my family's legacy with paperwork and threats. Now no lawyer, no HOA fine, and no smug letter could stop the water rushing into their foundations. By dawn, the development looked less like a neighborhood and more like a disaster zone. Cars were half submerged in driveways. Playsets sank into mud. Decorative fountains overflowed until they cracked under pressure. The artificial pond that had once been the centerpiece of their luxury community merged with the flood, swelling into a lake that lapped at front porches. 35 homes, all of them built on stolen soil, were drowning. The HOA, predictably, reacted with fury. Word spread quickly through the residents that their dam, the one they now believed belonged to them, had been tampered with. They accused me openly, though they had no proof beyond suspicion. Their newsletters dripped with threats of legal action. Their board members, barely weeks into existence, postured like generals preparing for war. But they overlooked one detail. The dam was mine. Every record, every map, every deed proved it. They could posture all they wanted, but when it came to ownership, they had no leg to stand on. All they could do was try to spin the story, painting me as a menace, a recluse unwilling to cooperate with community standards. It was laughable. The county eventually got involved, called out by frantic homeowners demanding answers. Inspectors trudged through knee-deep water, clipboards in hand, trying to assess what went wrong. Developers, red-faced and sweating, insisted the water release was an act of God. But the truth was written all over the land. The dam had existed long before the homes, long before the roads, long before anyone dreamed of a gated community here. It was part of my inheritance, a structure documented in county archives decades earlier. Nothing about it belonged to them. Still, the HOA didn't back down. They doubled down instead. Letters arrived almost daily now. Some demanded urgent compliance with their rules. Others threatened lawsuits, claiming the damage to homes was my responsibility. They framed it as negligence, as if I had some duty to regulate the flow of water for their benefit. They ignored the reality. They had built on land they never owned. In private, though, I could sense the cracks forming. Homeowners were furious, not just at me, but at the developers and the HOA board itself. They wanted answers for why their dream homes were suddenly underwater. They demanded accountability, but the HOA board offered only scapegoats. And I was the most convenient one. Yet something remarkable began to happen. The very people who had signed those glossy contracts, who had moved in under the promise of community-first living, started realizing the truth. A handful of residents began looking into deeds, into county maps, into public records. It didn't take long for the story to unravel. The land wasn't theirs. The HOA had overreached. The developers had gambled with stolen property. Whispers turned into anger. That anger turned into division. Neighbors who once trusted their HOA board now questioned every decision. The unity the HOA depended on was collapsing. What had once been their strength was becoming their weakness. I didn't interfere. I didn't need to. The water had done its work. It had exposed the fragility of their community, both literally and figuratively. What followed was inevitable. Insurance companies began refusing claims, citing construction defects and disputes over land ownership. Banks started raising alarms about the mortgages tied to illegally built homes. Families who had invested their Savings realized they were trapped in a nightmare with no easy escape. And through it all, the HOA screamed louder, trying to mask its desperation with threats it could no longer enforce. As for me, I remained silent. I continued to walk my land, checking the dam, maintaining it just as my grandfather had taught me. I didn't need to justify my actions to anyone. The land spoke for itself. The water spoke louder still. But I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA wasn't going to accept defeat. They had money, lawyers, and a vested interest in survival. They weren't going to walk away quietly. They would come after me harder than ever before. And when they did, I would need to be ready. Not just with deeds and records, but with a resolve strong enough to withstand the storm that was surely coming. The dam had been opened once. The homes had been tested. The HOA was floundering, but the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. The flood had weakened the foundations, but the real war was only beginning. By the time the water receded, the neighborhood was scarred beyond recognition. Mud streaked the streets, warped fences leaned at angles, and debris from waterlogged. Furniture piled up on the curbs like silent tombstones of broken dreams. The glossy promise of luxury community living had been shattered, but the homeowners were still clinging to one hope: their HOA. For them, the HOA was the authority, the savior, the enforcer. And when people feel cornered, they cling to any authority that promises stability. That was exactly what the board members fed on. They rallied their residents with fiery newsletters, claiming that the catastrophe was an attack. According to them, I had deliberately sabotaged their homes. They painted me as a bitter recluse who hated progress, a villain who hoarded water like a tyrant and weaponized it against innocent families. It was all lies, of course. But lies, when repeated loudly enough, start to sound like truth, especially to people desperate for someone to blame. Within weeks, the HOA escalated from letters to lawsuits. Thick envelopes arrived at my doorstep, filled with demands for compensation. They claimed damages exceeding millions, destroyed property, structural repairs, devalued homes. They insisted I pay, not just for what the water had done, but for every future risk they imagined. According to them, the entire development now lived under the constant threat of flooding, and the responsibility to correct that threat rested squarely on my shoulders. I didn't flinch. My grandfather had taught me to keep records of everything. The dam, the land deeds, the surveys, the maintenance logs, they were all airtight. My property, my right, my responsibility. No amount of HOA bluster could erase that. But I wasn't naive. I knew paper alone wouldn't protect me forever. The HOA had resources. They weren't just neighbors pooling pocket money. They were a machine funded by dues, backed by developers, and connected to legal teams that thrived on intimidation. For them, crushing me wasn't just about reclaiming community harmony. It was about setting an example. They needed to prove no one could stand against them. The legal harassment was only one side of the war. The other side was personal. Suddenly, strangers began appearing near my land. Men with clipboards stood at the edges, snapping photos, taking notes. Homeowners wandered further onto my property than before, using flimsy excuses like surveying, water flow, or inspecting community boundaries. Once I caught a group of board members clustered at the dam, measuring it as if they were preparing to stake their claim by force. Their arrogance was astonishing. They believed their authority extended beyond their homes, as though their signatures on HOA bylaws gave them dominion over everything they desired. The harassment spread beyond the land. Rumors circulated in town, whispers at the grocery store, cold stares at the post office. It became clear the HOA was spreading its poison beyond the subdivision. They wanted me ostracized, discredited, and despised. To them, it wasn't enough to fight me on paper. They wanted to bury me socially, but with every attack, my resolve only hardened. What they didn't realize was that the flood hadn't just exposed their fragile houses, it had exposed the cracks in their community. The homeowners weren't as united as the board wanted to believe. Arguments brewed behind closed doors. Some families quietly contacted lawyers of their own, not against me, but against the developers and the HOA itself. They wanted refunds, buyouts, or accountability for being duped into buying homes on contested land. That division was my silent weapon. I didn't need to rally them. I didn't need to speak a word. The truth, like the water, had already begun seeping into their foundations. Still, the board pressed harder. They called emergency meetings, raising HOA dues to cover legal costs, insisting the fight was righteous. Some homeowners balked, but most paid, either out of fear or desperation. With that new war chest, the HOA filed injunctions, demanding access to my dam under the guise of public safety. They argued in court that the structure, though on my property, was now a shared community resource because its water affected them. It was laughable, like claiming ownership of the sun because sunlight hit their lawns. The first hearings were grueling. Their lawyers arrived polished and confident, armed with binders of exaggerated claims. They described me as a rogue landowner who endangered families. They called the dam a ticking time bomb. They argued that control must be transferred to the HOA for proper management. I countered with facts. My attorney, though outnumbered, dismantled their arguments with cold precision. Every deed, every survey, every maintenance record stood as proof. The judge didn't rule immediately, but I could see in his eyes. The HOA's arrogance was grating, their entitlement suffocating. The law favored property rights, and my rights were undeniable. But the HOA wasn't playing to win in court alone. They were playing to exhaust me. They wanted endless hearings, endless filings, endless fees, bleeding me dry until I caved. For them, it wasn't about justice. It was about pressure. I adapted. While they burned money and time on legal theatrics, I doubled down on maintaining my land. I reinforced the dam, repaired erosion, and ensured everything was secure. Inspectors from the county came and left, each report affirming the dam was sound, my practices responsible. Every confirmation chipped away at the HOA's claims. And as I worked, I watched. I watched their streets crumble under the weight of water damage. I watched mold creep into homes, insurance battles spiral, and resentment simmer among neighbors, forced to pay higher dues for a war they hadn't signed up for. The HOA board's power was slipping, and they didn't even see it. But I did. They had turned this fight into a spectacle, believing they were invincible. But what they didn't realize was that every move they made tightened the noose around their own necks. And when the breaking point came, I would be ready. The war with the HOA had reached a fever pitch. For months they had battered me with lawsuits, accusations, and smear campaigns. Yet despite their noise, the truth remained immovable. The land and the dam were mine. Each hearing, each inspection, and each legal review confirmed it. But arrogance doesn't fade with proof, and entitlement doesn't die with facts. The HOA board had grown desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. At first, their efforts to seize control had been confined to paperwork and courtrooms. They believed their signatures, stamped bylaws, and inflated legal bills gave them leverage. When that failed, they pivoted to pressure tactics, hoping to wear me down. But when none of it broke me, they made the mistake of moving from paper battles to physical ones. It began subtly. Unfamiliar trucks lingered near the entrance to my property. Surveying equipment appeared where none had been authorized. Small orange flags sprouted in the soil like weeds, marking invisible lines that didn't belong. At first I thought it was more harassment, just another attempt to rattle me. But the pattern became clear. They weren't just harassing. They were plotting. One morning, I found fresh tire tracks leading straight to the dam. The gate that had stood untouched for decades bore new scratches, as though someone had tested its strength. Whoever it was had no business there. They hadn't come to look. They had come to take. It became undeniable when the HOA sent a notice, declaring the dam unsafe and announcing their intention to secure it for the protection of the community. The arrogance was staggering. Without court approval, without county authority, they claimed they would physically seize control of my property. It was no longer a battle of words. It was a siege. Days later, they acted on their threat. A convoy of HOA board members and contractors marched onto my land under the banner of public safety enforcement. They carried tools, clipboards, and an air of superiority, as though their presence alone made them legitimate. They moved with entitlement, barking orders to one another, circling the dam as if it were already theirs. From my vantage point, I watched them, silent and still. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. Land is defended not by shouting, but by standing firm when others trespass. This was my land, my dam, my responsibility, and I would not let them claim it. When they realized I was there, their posturing grew bolder. They pointed at the gate, gestured toward the water, and began installing locks of their own on the access wheel. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. They were attempting to overwrite history, to pretend ownership into existence by force. But their arrogance blinded them to the danger they were creating. The dam wasn't just a piece of concrete. It was a carefully balanced structure. Its gates, sluices, and spillways required knowledge and caution. Mishandling it wasn't just illegal, it was catastrophic. By tampering with what they didn't understand, they risked triggering the very disaster they claimed to prevent. County officials were called, summoned by my complaints and by the HOA's brazen announcements. When they arrived, the sight was damning. Untrained HOA members fumbling with a decades-old mechanism they had no right to touch. Inspectors recorded everything. Reports were filed. And though the officials didn't arrest anyone, the HOA's actions were documented as trespassing and reckless endangerment. But the HOA didn't see humiliation. They spun it as victory. In their newsletters, they bragged about their inspection of the dam, claiming they had stepped up where the county failed. They declared themselves protectors, defenders of families against my supposed negligence. To their residents, they painted themselves as heroes. Yet, behind closed doors, cracks widened. The fines they had imposed on residents to fund lawsuits now ballooned further to cover safety operations. Families already drowning in water damage were now drowning in fees. Meetings grew heated. Neighbors who once followed blindly began questioning why their money was vanishing into endless battles. Some demanded to know why the HOA was trespassing on land they didn't own, why the board was provoking a war instead of seeking resolution. But the board doubled down. They couldn't admit defeat. Admitting they had no authority meant admitting they had built their empire on lies. And so they escalated further. Late one night, I caught them again. This time, under cover of darkness, figures crept toward the dam with heavier equipment: chains, padlocks, even a generator-powered drill. They were determined to take control permanently, to strip me of authority by physically barring me from my own gate. I didn't confront them. I didn't shout or threaten. Instead, I documented everything: photos, videos, logs, evidence that would later speak louder than any HOA proclamation. But as I stood in the shadows, watching them meddle with my grandfather's legacy, the anger in me boiled hotter than ever before. These people weren't neighbors. They weren't protectors. They were thieves dressed in bureaucracy. Their tampering didn't last long. Rain came in the following days, heavy and unrelenting. The dam groaned under the surge, but it held as it always had. Yet the locks they had installed warped under pressure, jamming one of the gates. Water overflowed in places it never had before, carving new paths into the earth, pooling in low areas of the subdivision. Their ignorance had created the very danger they feared. When the water spilled once more into their pristine neighborhood, panic erupted. Driveways collapsed into sinkholes. Yards turned into bogs. Basements filled with foul, stagnant water. And though they tried to blame me again, this time the county saw the truth. Reports were filed. Evidence was reviewed. The HOA had tampered with a regulated structure. Their recklessness was undeniable. But instead of retreating, they dug in deeper. They held emergency town halls, whipping their residents into a frenzy. They declared me an enemy of progress, a selfish recluse clinging to land that should serve the community. They promised they would not stop until the dam, and the land itself, was under their control. From my hilltop, I looked down at the homes sinking further into chaos. The board was desperate, their power slipping through their fingers like the very water they tried to control. And I knew with a cold certainty that their desperation would soon push them to their most reckless move yet. The flood had been a warning. The lawsuits had been a battle. The trespass had been a siege. But what was coming next would be war. The storm that had been brewing between me and the HOA finally reached its breaking point. For months they had trespassed, tampered, and spread lies. They had bled their residents dry with fees, blamed me for their own failures, and poisoned the town with their propaganda. But their control was slipping. The residents were restless. The county was watching, and the water had made fools of them again and again. Desperation breeds recklessness. The board of the HOA, once so smug and self-assured, now found themselves cornered. Their lawsuits had stalled. Their trespassing had been exposed. Their tampering had backfired. But instead of backing down, they escalated to the unthinkable. It happened on a Sunday morning, when the neighborhood was at its quietest. A caravan of vehicles rolled onto my land, this time not with surveyors or inspectors, but with contractors carrying heavy machinery. At the head of the convoy were the board members, puffed up with false authority, clutching papers they claimed were emergency orders. In reality, they were nothing more than bluffs dressed in official language. But their plan was clear. They weren't going to fight me in court anymore. They were going to take the dam by force. The contractors, paid and uninformed, set up equipment near the gate. They began drilling, cutting, and preparing to dismantle the mechanisms that had controlled the water for decades. Their goal was to strip the dam of its controls, to bypass me completely, and to seize the flow for themselves. To them, it was a show of dominance, a way to prove the landowner couldn't stop the community. But what they didn't realize was that their actions were not only illegal, they were suicidal. The dam was a delicate structure, old but reliable. Every gear, every bolt, every piece had been maintained with care and knowledge. To meddle with it blindly was to invite catastrophe, and catastrophe came swiftly. As they drilled into the mechanism, the gate shuddered. The pressure that had been carefully regulated for decades suddenly surged with no release. The water roared louder, straining against the weakened gate until the bolts groaned. Then, with a metallic scream, one side of the gate cracked open. The flood that followed wasn't controlled like before. It wasn't a deliberate release. It was chaos. A wall of water thundered down the valley, sweeping through the subdivision with unstoppable force. Streets became rivers. Cars were lifted like toys. Lawns dissolved into torrents of mud. The decorative pond that had once been, their pride burst its banks, merging with the flood, until the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Panic erupted. Homeowners scrambled, clutching children and belongings, as they waded through waist-high water. The board members, who had orchestrated the disaster, shouted orders no one could hear over the roar. Their arrogance had summoned the very destruction they feared most. From my hilltop I watched with grim clarity. This wasn't vengeance anymore. It was consequence. The land doesn't bow to bylaws. The water doesn't obey arrogance. Nature does not negotiate with entitlement. When the waters finally receded hours later, the neighborhood lay in ruins. 35 homes, each marketed as luxury living, were scarred beyond recognition. Foundations cracked, walls buckled, driveways crumbled into sinkholes. The dream had drowned in the flood, leaving only soggy remnants of ambition and greed. But the damage didn't stop at the homes. The HOA itself was now fractured beyond repair. Residents turned on the board with fury. They demanded answers for why their money, their trust, and their safety had been gambled away. The board tried to spin the narrative again, insisting I had caused the collapse. But this time, the evidence was undeniable. County inspectors arrived to find the dam damaged, the mechanisms tampered with, and HOA contractors' tools scattered across the site. The reports were brutal. The HOA wasn't just accused of trespassing anymore. They were accused of reckless destruction of property, criminal tampering with a regulated structure, and endangerment of lives. What had once been a civil battle over land rights was now a criminal investigation. The lawsuits they had filed against me evaporated in the face of new charges against them. Their lawyers, once confident, now scrambled to shield the board members from liability. But the residents weren't interested in protecting them anymore. Families, bankrupt and broken, began filing suits of their own, this time against the HOA itself. The subdivision, once a symbol of community living, was now a battlefield of finger-pointing, lawsuits, and shattered trust. The HOA board was drowning in the very flood they had unleashed. As for me, I remained steady. The dam had taken damage, yes, but I knew how to rebuild it. My grandfather's notes, my own records, and my patience were more reliable than any HOA decree. I began repairs, slowly and methodically, as inspectors confirmed once again that the land was mine and the dam was never theirs to touch. For the first time since the battle began, I felt the tide truly turning. The HOA was no longer the aggressor. It was the defendant. Their desperation had undone them, and their arrogance had destroyed their own kingdom. But I knew the fight wasn't completely over. Pride is stubborn, and arrogance doesn't die easily. Even as their walls crumbled, the board still clung to scraps of power. They still had signatures, bank accounts, and the will to drag the battle further. And though the water had shown them its fury, I suspected they hadn't yet learned their lesson. The final reckoning was coming. The flood that ripped through the subdivision marked the turning point. The carefully manicured lawns, the pristine cul-de-sacs, the promises of luxury living, all of it had been drowned in the very water the HOA tried to steal. What was left behind wasn't just wreckage of homes. It was wreckage of trust, of arrogance, of a community built on lies. In the days that followed, the chaos only deepened. County, eager to officials swarmed the neighborhood, documenting every collapsed foundation, every ruined wall, every gaping sinkhole. News crews arrived, captured the story of a gated community unraveling from within. Headlines screamed about reckless HOA tampering and homes built on disputed land. What had once been a local battle now became a cautionary tale broadcast, far beyond the county lines. The HOA board, so vocal and proud, suddenly found themselves silenced. Their bravado was replaced with fear as lawsuits piled up. This time, it wasn't me defending against their claims. It was them drowning under dozens of suits from their own residents. Families who had once trusted their leadership now demanded Justice for the money, safety, and futures stolen from them. Insurance companies turned their backs, refusing to cover damages caused by illegal interference with the dam. Mortgage lenders froze accounts, unwilling to finance homes built on contested property. The HOA's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was imploding. And through it all, the truth of ownership stood like bedrock beneath the flood. My family's deeds, maps, and records were now more than dusty documents. They were lifelines of justice. The county confirmed once and for all that the land belonged to me. The dam was mine, legally and historically. Every action the HOA had taken was trespass, theft, or sabotage. The narrative they had spun for so long was obliterated by facts they could no longer twist. For the board members, consequences came swiftly. Criminal charges were filed: trespassing, reckless endangerment, unlawful tampering with a regulated structure. The very people who had once claimed to protect their community now stood accused of endangering it. Their names, once printed proudly on HOA newsletters, now appeared in court dockets. Their reputations were not just tarnished, they were destroyed. The residents, though victims of the board's hubris, were not spared from hardship. Many lost their homes outright, unable to afford the repairs or the legal mess that followed. Some packed up and left, abandoning their dream houses to rot. Others stayed, not out of hope, but out of necessity, trapped in properties worth a fraction of what they had paid. The subdivision that had once been advertised as a shining example of suburban living was now whispered about as a cautionary tale. A failed community built on stolen ground, drowned by its own greed. As for me, I carried no joy in their suffering. The battle had never been about vengeance for its own sake. It had been about survival, about defending what was mine, about honoring the legacy of my grandfather who had poured his life into this land. Watching families lose everything wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. It proved what I had known all along. When greed tries to control what it does not understand, destruction follows. With the legal battles settled in my favor, I turned my focus back to the dam. The damage caused by the HOA's reckless tampering had been severe, but not irreparable. Slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt the mechanisms, restoring their strength and reliability. It took months of work, but with each repair, I felt a sense of balance returning. The water flowed as it was meant to, steady, controlled, respectful of both the land and those downstream. My grandfather's legacy lived on, untarnished by the chaos that had tried to consume it. The land around the failed subdivision began to reclaim itself. Grass grew over cracked sidewalks. Weeds pushed through crumbled driveways. The skeletons of half-abandoned houses stood as monuments to arrogance, slowly being swallowed by the earth they had disrespected. Nature has a way of erasing mistakes, of reminding those who trespass that time and patience will always outlast entitlement. In town, people who once whispered about me with suspicion now spoke differently. The story of the HOA had spread, and with it, the truth of what had really happened. The villain they had painted me as was gone, replaced by the reality of a landowner who had stood his ground against a machine of greed. Respect replaced suspicion. The same neighbors who once stared coldly now nodded in quiet acknowledgement. But the greatest victory wasn't in the courts or in the collapse of the HOA. It was in the silence that returned to the land. No more contractors stomping through fields. No more HOA board members shouting about bylaws. No more trucks carving tire tracks where they didn't belong. Just the sound of water flowing, steady and calm, as it had for generations. The HOA had believed they could control everything with rules, fines, and arrogance. But they had forgotten the simplest truth. Some things cannot be controlled. Some things belong to the land, not to paperwork. And when you try to steal what isn't yours, the land always takes it back. Looking down from the hill one final time, I saw the ruins of 35 homes that never should have been built. I saw the scars of greed etched into the earth. And I saw the dam standing strong, proof that legacy endures when arrogance falls. The HOA was gone. The residents scattered. The battle was over. And the water kept flowing, just as it always had.